right to rule. The people of Serios remembered the winter famine of 20 years ago, when grain ships bound for their harbors mysteriously sank in calm waters, ships carrying food bought from Avarian merchants. The people of Avar had not forgotten the burning of their frontier city, Norith, a crime the Serios king denied but could never quite wash from his hands. Every insult, every loss, had been tucked away like dry tinder, waiting for the smallest spark. That spark came in the summer of the Red Moon, when a border patrol found the body of a Serios envoy nailed to a pine tree in the disputed lands, his eyes carved out, his hands bound in the Avarian style of executing traitors. It was a message that could not be ignored. King Dorvan of Serios, grey-bearded but still sharp as a drawn blade, swore before his court that he would march on Avar and end the feud before the year was done. But while the war drums sounded in Serios, another kind of drumbeat began in the court of Avar. High Chancellor Vedrik, chief strategist to the Avarian ruler, had long believed that victory in this inevitable war would not come from greater numbers or sharper steel. It would come from breaking the enemy's heart before the battle truly began. And to do that, he needed a weapon that struck not the body, but the very will of the army. This is where the story narrows, focusing from kingdoms and courts to a single man, an assassin named Carthan Vey. Once a soldier in the Serios army, Carthan had been captured in a border raid, spared execution by the Avarians in exchange for his service. He had lived for 6 years under a false name, serving in the shadows, his skills sharpened like the edge of a whetstone. But unlike most killers for hire, Carthan was not free. He carried a private vendetta against the Serios general, Lord Harak Valen, the man who, years earlier, had abandoned Carthan's unit in a retreat, condemning them to slaughter. Carthan had survived, but at a cost. His family believed him dead, his honor was buried in a shallow grave, and his loyalty to Serios was replaced by a cold hunger for revenge. It was Vedrik who saw the use in that hunger. The plan was simple in its outline and impossible in its risk: arm Carthan with a weapon tipped in the venom of the black viper, a toxin so rare that only a handful of apothecaries knew how to harvest it without dying. The venom killed not with speed, but with certainty, fever, paralysis, and death within hours. If the spear could strike General Harak in the opening stages of battle, the morale of the Serios army would shatter, and the war might be decided before it had truly begun. The thought of poison in war was not new, but it was despised. In the codes of both kingdoms, such a weapon was considered dishonorable, a betrayal of the warrior's craft. To be caught with it was to be condemned as less than human. This taboo was part of what made it so devastating. The soldiers of Serios would not only lose their commander, they would lose faith in the fairness of the fight itself. And faith, more than steel, was what kept men standing when the world around them broke. On the eve of the march, the two armies moved like opposing storms toward the wide field known as Arthan's Crossing. Farmers abandoned their homes, driving cattle and children ahead of them into the hills. Merchants shuttered their shops, and priests prayed in temples that smelled of incense and fear. Along the old road leading north, Serios soldiers marched in tight formation, their armor gleaming in the last sunset before the clash. In the forests beyond, Carthan Vey moved alone, silent as a shadow, the poisoned spear wrapped in linen and bound to his back. As night fell, both camps prepared in their own ways. In the Serios tents, men told stories to keep fear away, passing flasks of bitter mead until their tongues loosened and their eyes grew heavy. In the Avarian camp, the mood was colder, quieter, every soldier seemed to be conserving their strength for the storm to come. Somewhere in the darkness, Carthan sat alone, running his fingers over the spear's shaft, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He knew that if he failed, he would die before the sun touched the horizon again. He also knew that if he succeeded, the fate of two nations would pivot on a single moment. And so the night deepened. Stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to the plans of kings and killers. In the east, a thin band of pale light began to rise. Dawn would come soon. And with it, the poisoned spear would leave its mark on history, and decide a war. The first day's march began under a sky the color of tarnished bronze. The sun had not yet burned away the morning mist, and the land ahead seemed endless, a great flat expanse broken only by distant tree lines and the dark silhouette of the Ardennes hills. The two armies advanced toward each other like slow-moving storms, each step a drumbeat in the rhythm of war. For the men of Serios, the road north was familiar. They had drilled on it in peacetime, paraded down it during festivals, and now marched upon it in silence. The veterans knew that a long march before battle was a war in itself, the aches in the legs, the weight of armor biting into the shoulders, the dry throat, and the sweat beneath the collar. Yet no one faltered. They had faith in their commander, Lord Harak Valen, a man whose reputation was as ironclad as his breastplate. Harak himself rode at the center of the column, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was no fool. He knew that the dominion of Avar was not coming to meet him in open battle without some hidden plan. But Harak trusted in numbers, in discipline, and in the unwavering loyalty of his troops. He believed, as many generals before him had, that the tide of war was decided by the greater will, not by single strokes of chance. In the Avarian camp, however, the will of the army was guided by a different philosophy. Chancellor Vedric had no illusions about matching Serios in open combat. His strategy was like a serpent's: wait in stillness, strike at the heart, and let the body collapse on its own. He had already begun moving his pieces into place. Carthan Vey, carrying the poisoned spear wrapped in plain cloth, was embedded among a small vanguard of Avarian scouts. His orders were to cross the flanks during the chaos of the opening charge and position himself for a single, decisive throw. It was a mission with no promise of escape. Every step he took toward the battlefield felt heavier, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the moment he released the spear, his life, in whatever shape it had taken since his capture, would be over. Along the march, both armies engaged in the rituals that bound warriors together. Serios soldiers cleaned their blades until they shone, painted symbols of their household gods onto their shields, and tied tokens from loved ones to their belts. In Avar, the preparations were quieter, almost ritualistic in their precision. Archers rubbed beeswax on their bowstrings, spearmen tested their grips, and the camp's healers laid out herbs and bandages for wounds that would come before the day was done. But beneath these preparations was another battle, one fought not with steel but with information. Scouts darted ahead, slipping between the folds of the land, counting banners, measuring distances, and noting the placement of supply wagons. Messengers galloped between the moving columns, their words brief but urgent. It was the kind of intelligence work that ancient wars were built upon, where a single false report could doom an army. That evening, both sides made camp within a day's march of Ardennes Crossing. Fires burned low under the watchful gaze of sentries, and the air carried the mixed scents of wood smoke, sweat, and damp earth. In the Serios command tent, Harak spread maps across a wooden table, tracing his finger along the planned formation, heavy infantry at the center, cavalry poised to break the enemy's flanks. His voice was calm but firm as he instructed his captains: strike fast. Strike clean. Give them no time to breathe. Across the plain, Vedric issued his own orders in a hushed tone. He spoke not of grand maneuvers, but of moments: the instant the Serios cavalry committed, the signal for Carthan to advance, the precise heartbeat when the poisoned spear would fly. Around him, officers nodded grimly. This war would not be won by glory. It would be won by one man's throw. As the campfires dimmed and the plain sank into darkness, the two armies seemed like sleeping beasts, each gathering strength for the violence to come. In that quiet, Carthan sat apart, turning the wrapped spear in his hands, imagining the weight of its flight, the sound it would make cutting through the air, and the silence that would follow when it found its mark. At dawn, the march would end. At dawn, destiny would begin. Before the first horn of battle was sounded, before the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel, there were memories, sharp as blades, heavy as shields. For Carthan Vey, the battlefield ahead was not only a place of war, it was the stage for an oath he had carried in silence for years. The night before the armies reached Ardennes Crossing, Carthan stood apart from the Avarian soldiers, staring into the embers of a dying fire. His mind drifted back to that fateful retreat years earlier, when his unit had been abandoned by Lord Harak Valen. The screams of his comrades still clung to him like smoke, the taste of blood in his mouth returned with every heartbeat. He had sworn then, with the bodies of his friends lying cold around him, that if he ever stood within reach of Harak, he would end him. But war is not made of oaths alone. It is made of calculation, timing, and the willingness to do what others will not. Carthan had killed before, but always in the shadows, with the anonymity of night to cloak him. This time would be different. This kill would be public, in the chaos of a battle where every eye might see the moment he let the poisoned spear fly. He would be striking not just at a man, but at the beating heart of an entire army. In the Serios camp, Harak Valen prepared in his own way. His armor was polished to a mirror sheen, his sword oiled and ready. He had spent the day riding among his men, speaking to them not as a distant commander but as a brother in arms. He told them stories of past victories, of battles where Serios had been outnumbered but had triumphed through discipline and courage. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had faced death and walked away every time. What Harak did not know, what he could not know, was that one of his oldest enemies was in the enemy ranks, carrying a weapon designed to undo all that certainty. To Harak, the coming battle was another test of leadership and strategy. To Carthan, it was the culmination of a personal war that had been burning far longer than the one between their nations. Historians have long debated the morality of assassinations in war. In both Serios and Ivar, the warrior code celebrated courage, skill, and the facing of one's enemy in open combat. Poison was seen as treachery, a weapon of cowards. But codes and honor mean little to men who have been left for dead. For Carthan, the poisoned spear was not cowardice, it was justice sharpened to a deadly point. As dawn approached, each man, one seeking revenge, the other seeking victory, lay awake in his tent. The sounds of the camp were muted, the distant stamp of a horse, the creak of leather, the muffled cough of a sentry. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes every breath feel heavier. In a few hours, the field at Arthun's Crossing would become a furnace of blood and steel. And somewhere in that storm, the poisoned spear would find its flight. The morning at Arthun's Crossing began with a silence so sharp it seemed unnatural. Mist clung to the grass, curling around the boots of soldiers as they took their places. The river that cut through the plain glimmered faintly in the pale light, its banks soon to be stained by the day's work. The first sound was the low groan of war horns from the Ivarian side, a deep, resonant note that rolled across the plain like distant thunder. In response, the Serios horns answered, higher, sharper, defiant. Banners lifted in the breeze, and the rhythm of boots and hooves began to build. The two forces, once distant shapes, now became distinct, rows of shields, the glitter of spearheads, the silhouettes of mounted commanders. Harak Valen rode along the front of his lines, his voice carrying above the clamor, "Hold steady. Shields high, eyes forward." His presence was a wall against fear, his men's confidence swelling with each pass of his horse. He believed the day would be theirs. On the opposite side, Chancellor Vedrick surveyed the Serios formation, his mind ticking through timing and angles like the gears of a hidden machine. Beside him, hidden among the forward skirmishers, Carthan Ve gripped the wrapped spear, feeling the weight of destiny pressing against his palm. His instructions were simple: wait for the cavalry to commit, slip into the chaos, and strike when the target was exposed. The first clash came with the roar of Serios' heavy infantry slamming into Ivar's forward shield wall. The air filled with the clang of metal, the thud of spears on shields, the grunt of bodies straining against each other. Arrows hissed overhead, some finding their marks, others snapping uselessly into the earth. Dust began to rise, blurring the edges of the field. Serios' cavalry surged forward, seeking to punch through the Ivar flank. The ground trembled under the hooves, a wave of muscle and steel. In that moment, Vedrick gave the smallest nod, and Carthan moved. He slipped through the fray, using the distraction of the charge to mask his advance. The poisoned spear, now unwrapped, gleamed dully, its tip stained with venom invisible to the naked eye. Through the chaos, Carthan spotted Harak. The general was issuing orders from horseback, leaning forward to signal his right flank. His armor caught the morning light in brief flashes, making him a beacon among the turmoil. Carthan's pulse slowed, the strange calm that comes to men who know the moment has come. He stepped into a gap between clashing soldiers, drew back his arm, and let the spear fly. It cut through the air with a sound unlike any other, a whisper and a hiss, the voice of inevitability. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Then the spear struck. It caught Harak beneath the arm, slipping through the joint in his armor where metal met leather. The general let out a sharp gasp, his body recoiling from the force. At first, the wound seemed survivable, just another injury in the chaos of war. But Carthan knew better. The venom began its silent work immediately. Harak's grip on his reins loosened, his commands faltered. Around him, his captains shouted for order, unaware that the poison was already unraveling their leader from within. Carthan did not wait to see more. He vanished back into the chaos, swallowed by the crush of bodies and the smoke of battle. Minutes passed. Harak tried to rally his men, but each breath grew shorter, each movement heavier. His vision swam. The Serios lines, once solid and unbreakable, began to waver. Soldiers glanced toward their commander, saw the weakness in his posture, and felt the first cold fingers of doubt wrap around their hearts. On the Avarian side, the sight of Harak struggling sent a ripple of energy through the ranks. Their war cries grew louder, their strikes more ferocious. Vedric's gamble had worked, the heart of the Serios army was faltering, and with it, their will to fight. The mist was gone now, burned away by the heat of battle. The sun shone brightly on Arthan's crossing, revealing the truth in full. One poisoned spear had begun to decide the fate of two nations. The moment Harak Valen's posture sagged, the battle's rhythm changed. It was not a loud change, not a trumpet blast or a shattering roar, but a subtle unraveling, a shift in the heartbeat of the Serios army. Men who had, moments before, fought with precision and unity now stole glances toward their commander, searching for the steady presence that had anchored them through countless campaigns. Harak tried to mask his condition, forcing his back straight and his voice steady. But the venom was merciless. His left hand trembled on the reins, his right gripped the hilt of his sword more for balance than for use. Every breath was a shallow drag of air, every heartbeat a drum of warning in his ears. The poison was winning. A captain rode to his side, eyes wide with alarm. "My lord, you're bleeding." "It's nothing," Harak cut in, his words clipped. But the lie was too thin to hold. The front lines began to falter. Without Harak's steady signals, the infantry lost cohesion. Shield walls broke in places, exposing gaps that the Avarian soldiers exploited with ruthless precision. Cavalry units, unsure of whether to press or pull back, hesitated just long enough for the enemy to push their advantage. In war, morale is a fragile thing. Once it cracks, it can shatter entirely. The sight of Harak leaning in the saddle, his face pale, his movements sluggish, sent whispers through the ranks: the general's hurt. The general's falling. Panic, even in its smallest seed, spread faster than fire. On the Avarian side, Chancellor Vedric's eyes locked on the change. He signaled the order to press harder. Fresh reserves surged forward, their shields battering weakened lines, their spears finding targets in the disarray. Every blow landed with more confidence, each push driving the Serios soldiers further back. Amid the chaos, Carthan Ve melted into anonymity. His mission was complete, and survival was now his only concern. He moved with the retreating press of soldiers, keeping his head low, just another figure in the storm. No one knew his name, no one saw the satisfaction, grim and hollow, in his eyes. Harak's condition worsened rapidly. His sword slipped from his grasp, clattering against the armor of his horse before falling into the mud. Two aides moved to steady him, but he waved them off weakly. His pride would not allow him to be carried from the field, yet neither pride nor will could slow the venom in his veins. By midday, the collapse was no longer a possibility but a reality. Units broke away entirely, retreating toward the river in a desperate bid to regroup. The Avarians seized the moment, driving forward with relentless force, cutting down the stragglers and capturing pockets of resistance. The once proud army of Serios was now a scattering of weary men fleeing across the plain. The dominion of Avar had done what it could never have achieved in a fair fight. It had broken the spine of its rival in a single, surgical strike. As the sun reached its zenith, Harak was finally lifted from his horse by his aides. His eyes, clouded but still fierce, turned toward the field one last time. Around him, the world was dissolving into dust and defeat. The war for Serios was over, and it had ended with the whisper of a poisoned spear. Long after the dust of Arthan's crossing had settled, the poisoned spear continued to cast its shadow. The field itself, once a place of grain harvests and river trade, became known simply as the crossing of treachery and Serios ballots. To the dominion of Avar, it was remembered as the strike of justice. In truth, history carried both names, for truth itself had been poisoned that day. In the months that followed, Avar claimed victory and pressed deep into Serios territory. Cities surrendered without siege, their garrisons unwilling to stand without the general who had been their unshakable wall. Harak Valen's death became the subject of hushed debate in war councils across the continent. Was it a legitimate act of war, or an unforgivable breach of honor? The answer depended entirely on which banner you stood beneath. Carthan Vey vanished from the chronicles. Some claimed he escaped east into the mountains, living out his days as a nameless wanderer. Others insisted he was silenced by the very chancellor who had used him, a loose end tied off before it could unravel. What cannot be erased, however, is the fact that a single throw, no grand strategy, no months-long siege, had reshaped the destiny of two nations. Generals studied the battle for generations afterward, some seeing it as proof that precision could defeat might, others warning of the chaos that follows when the rules of war are bent too far. The poisoned spear became a symbol in both realms. In Serios, it was carved into memorial stones as a mark of treachery. In Avar, miniature replicas were gifted to young officers as reminders that victory sometimes demands the unthinkable. And yet, beyond the politics and the military lessons, there remained the human cost. The soldiers who never returned, the families displaced by the tide of conquest, the villages burned not by swords in honorable duels but by the collapse of an army robbed of its leader. No one could count the lives ended by that one act, just as no one could measure the weight it left on the soul of the man who carried it out. In the end, the spear itself was lost, whether buried with its victim, hidden by its wielder, or left to rot in the mud, no one knows. But the story endured, passed from fireside to throne room, reshaped by each telling. It asked a question that no era could answer without betraying something of itself. When the fate of nations hangs in the balance, is victory worth any cost?